The last week in graduate school with Corinthia. I spent my time studying modes of classical theological structure and considering how we're pushing back against them and what we're forming in response. The class was constructive theology of ministry. Who knows what that means, right? But it was really about how we understood the strategies of theological rhetoric and language and sort of the moves of theology, and as that related to ministry, and as it related, because it was Joe Bessler who was teaching the class, so as it related to politics, very heavily into politics. So it was a very interesting class. So you're going to be the beneficiaries and or victims of all of that work from the last week today. And we talked a lot about this allegory that is very present in biblical language and, of course, very present in our sort of public rhetoric right now. And it's this allegory of being awake and being asleep, right? A lot of mileage by this term woke. Now what woke means is being aware, like staying socially conscious, so that you know what things are being said and not being said, and you can see what things are being done and not being done, right? And you have some awareness around that. It's a term about being awake to something or having something revealed. I mean, that's all very biblical language, and it's so interesting to me that the people who push back on it are supposed to be the most deeply invested in the Bible. It's been misconstrued, or I would probably say co-opted, like it's a language of indoctrination. Which implies that actually the truth is being covered up, not revealed. So then you have to ask yourself, what truth do they think is being covered up? Which is its own interesting conversation.
Do you have an answer for why it's such an effective rhetorical tool negatively?
Sure. It's not a short answer. But, I mean, heck, we got some time. My short answer, my short version of the very long answer is that there's a construct. So we read a book by Kelly Brown Douglas, who is a theologian and scholar and Episcopal priest, and it's a book that she centers on the murder of Trayvon Martin and telling the story of that. I wish I could remember what the title of the book is. The subtitle is, what is it?
It's not the Black Christ, is it?
The Black Christ?
No, it is, the subtitle is Brown Bodies and God's Justice or something like that. Yeah, I sure wish I could remember. It's maybe Stand Your Ground. Yeah, that's what it is. Because she talks a lot about the stand your ground culture, which she ties to historical, goes way, way back into thinking about anybody know who that is? Not a Roman emperor, but a historian. Yeah, during Rome's, so Tacitus was a historian who wrote about Rome, the Roman Empire, and Tacitus encounters these Germanic tribes, and the tribes didn't call themselves Germanic. Tacitus called them Germanic. The tribes didn't call themselves this, but Tacitus called them Anglo-Saxons, right? And Tacitus's main praise of this group was that they were pure. They did not intermingle with other tribes. They stayed pure, and that they were this fiercely freedom-loving people. Which is, like, again, there's this assertion that there are people who are not freedom-loving, who don't like freedom, but and that he ascribed these characteristics to this, really, before this language was known, to this race of people. And their strength and their fierceness. This is ultimately part of the same group, which is, frankly, this is not the direction I thought we were going to go this morning, but this is good. Which is, frankly, has ties to Celtic traditions, to Germanic traditions. That's the part of the world that we're talking about right now. And also what the Romans called barbarians. These were all grouped into this collection of people that were just known to the Romans as barbarians. They called them barbarians because Tacitus is one of the people who did this, is that when they spoke their language, they hear them speaking, they sounded like they were saying bar, 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 bar. So they called them barbarians, right? Or barbarians. And that was just kind of like saying Gentiles, right? It was anybody who wasn't Roman, who wasn't part of the Roman umbrella. Which, by the way, the Roman umbrella had lots of diversity in it too. But there was this Roman citizenry thing. There was this imperial sort of thing. These were not imperial people. And what Tacitus really liked about them really became a big problem, because what he really liked about them is that this inherent love of freedom. Well, they also did not want to be part of an empire. And that doesn't work out very well for Rome. And eventually, Rome collapses. And in part due to some of the impact of certainly of the barbarians. Now that term Anglo-Saxon then becomes this whole different thing. And so what Douglas does is, by sort of weaving that history into talking about the importance of this figure and this historian, because the people who bring him up and talk about his fascination for the values that he places on these people. Again, this is not the values that the people said that they held. It's the values that Tacitus said that they held. So we have to keep that in mind. Tacitus holds this up as like the ideal way, of being, and it's this, the values you hold are freedom and purity and strength, right? That he places on those folks. And this strength, you can imagine, is a particular kind of strength. It's the rawest way that we would define that. And ultimately, in our context, it would mean sort of hypermasculine, a violent. It is a very Roman kind of strength, which is this is the motto of the empire: peace through victory. Right? So you get peace by conquering everybody else. You get peace by defeating others and usurping them. That's peace. And you maintain that by continuing to oppress and conquer those who are lesser than you. Right? We call that peace. Right? It's a very different kind of notion of peace than other historical places might hold up. So Tacitus ascribes these characteristics to this group, and who are the people who begin in the mid 1700s to lift up Tacitus and to consider him really pinpointing the exact set of values that need to be upheld. Well, there's a couple of guys who really mention him by name and pretty repeatedly in their writings. Their last names are Franklin and Jefferson. And so they call it this Anglo-Saxon way of being in the world. And so what that means in a United States that at that point is deeply invested in slavery, is deeply invested in the eradication of the native peoples who were there, how does that get defined, right? So it's this kind of mindset, and I want us to really pay attention in answering your question. And this is the short version, keep in mind. I really want us to think about how often you hear these three words in some form or fashion in our political discourse. We just went through this election. And how often did you hear these words, but being said in nuanced or in particular ways? Now, you don't hear this as much because it's not said that way. But what does it mean when we say, well, we need to get the illegals out? We need to get, this group needs to get out. Whoever this group is, they need to get out. They need to get out of the bathrooms, or they need to get out of the classrooms, or they need to get out of the country. Right? So we hear this language a lot, it just not with that particular word. Right? So that's this set of values, and this driven by this sort of notion, and again, Douglas does a masterful job of this, is really what lies behind even up to stand your ground kinds of laws. So she really uses, interestingly enough, never once says the name George Zimmerman. Says Trayvon Martin all the time. Never once says the name George Zimmerman, which is interesting, who's the man that shot Trayvon. But she talks about how that sort of notion of then freedom, purity, strength that is must be protected. So this has to be defended. And it can also be lodged in a particular place, right? In a particular area that is yours. And possession becomes this thing. And you also have in that this component right, of chosenness. That language is very biblical also, that we have to contend with. And it was heavily used, the same passages heavily used in the sort of invasion of this country by Europe, that this was the promised land, this was a chosen place. We are the chosen people. When I say we, I mean me. I am the chosen. That's my heritage, right? Comes from that chosenness.
Is there an element of you can't compromise, like diplomacy would be seen as weakness if you're watering it down if you don't, it's my way.
Right. That's what strength is. Peace through victory, not peace through compromise, not peace through cooperation, not peace through community or relationship or interaction. No, peace through victory. You conquer so especially when you have someone who is very transactional in their relationships, they see that as you win. That's how you win. So I just want us to know, that this lies very foundationally for lots of people in ways that they wouldn't express or recognize rationally. And it's so foundational that a pushback against this or a threat to this is really, really problematic and causes all kinds of anxiety. Right? So, what does it mean when you have all of that stuff in place in the core of people's being in ways that they don't even recognize, and you start saying that we should do I need to finish that? Right? Well, you need to do this. You need to do this.
We have nuclear weapons now.
Yeah. Victory becomes a whole different kind of thing. Okay, so that was in part what we were looking at last week in my class, and discussing the way that those moves get made, because contained in all of that is a theology as well, which, like, we don't have enough time to talk about that, but to recognize where the theological moves happen in that. So Joe had us study acceptance speeches at the conventions over the last few years. So he had us do Bill Clinton. He had us do, that was 92, I think. He had us do W. He had us do Obama. Had us do Trump, Biden, and Harris. Trump's first, 2016. And those are the acceptance speeches for the nomination. So at their own convention. And to do that and look at the language of that, now he laid out a formula. Joe's insistence is that there is a formula to all of this, and that you can kind of see this and see where the moves get made. Now they make them in different ways, and so that was kind of part of the study is where are the moves being made. I'm not sure I believe him or that I share that opinion, but there are some very interesting moves being made that he really asserts are theological ones. And there's involved in this is this sort of sense that there is a way of being in the world, that there's a normalness in the world, so that let me see if I can remember this. I probably can't. There's a binary that's offered so that you have this tension always being held. Hey, would you do me a favor and go get my laptop? It's underneath my desk, because I won't be able to remember it unless I see it.
Is it related to like political correctness? I think it's very much been rejected.
So we think about the ways that when you push back against that with language, I mean, what political correctness is all about, or even what wokeness is all about, is like the daring to question that normalcy, right? It's just recognizing that other people exist outside of that sphere, thank you, is unacceptable. So, so there's this acceptance of what is normal. This is, Joe would say, and I agree with him, the vestiges of of Plato's thought that went along with us. So in the first couple of centuries after the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the development of what we now call Christianity. Well, you ought to know, most scholars at this point don't think anything like Christianity, certainly not by that name, is known for 200 or 300 years. I mean, the real formation of that, the real solidifying event of that is in 325 at the Council of Nicaea. That's when you actually have Christianity really gelling, really setting. Prior to this, there's all kinds of diversity. Most of the groups don't call themselves Christian, if any of them don't call themselves Christian. They call themselves followers of Jesus, and let's say for the first 150 years, they consider themselves either decidedly Jewish or grafted on to Judaism in some way, shape, or form. Right? So that's a long, long time to not have what we would call, yeah. No popes before this. Nope. In fact, there's not popes for a long, long time. The head of the church is the emperor. Constantine is the head of the church in 325. And Constantine is the head of the church for the longest, until the fall of the Roman Empire. You don't have popes being the head of the church. You do have bishops, and they're there, but they're not the head of things. It's the emperor who's the head of. This is a sea change. This is the anti-imperial religion of whose founder was a peasant, an itinerant peasant in the backwoods of Judea, pushing back against the empire, becomes the imperial. There's no better way to say this than prior to 325, you could not be baptized if you were a soldier. After 325, you could not be a soldier unless you were baptized. I mean, think about that for a second. That's huge. And it changes everything, because then Christianity needs this whole different set of things. There are also really, historians and biblical scholars are really pushing the dates of things. So when I was in seminary, the dating of the Gospels was Mark is the earliest, probably about 70, and then you have Luke and Matthew who come after him, probably between 80 and 90, and then you have John who's a little later, maybe 95. They are now saying Luke is as late as 130, maybe even 150, Luke and Acts. Mark is much later. Matthew is much later. John has actually moved a little earlier. So there's a lot of movement going on right now as the archaeology and the sociology and the theological studies and the biblical studies kind of all interact. And the historians, for that matter.
I'm sorry, that just blew all my...
That's right. I know. Yeah. Gonna have to have a refresher. I got a good place for you to go. Right. Much later dates for everything, which kind of shifts the way that you think about what's going on and how this is all being written down and why this is all being written down, and it matters a lot. So if we are to think about so I said all of that to say that Plato the Platonic idea of things. So Plato lives hundreds of years before this. Let's just talk about the turn of the first century, so about 100 Common Era, 100 CE. Plato has lived hundreds of years before that. But Platonic thought is beginning to have this resurgence. You see it in the letters of Paul, where Paul uses Platonic thought to spread the message of Jesus. Paul, I think, is also deeply, deeply misunderstood. And we have, again, these attestments to the letters of Paul, which are some of the earliest of the writings, but then these letters attributed to Paul that could be much, much later, even 100 years after Paul, rewriting Paul and changing the way that he is thinking about things. Paul, depending on where you read Paul and how you want to read Paul, Paul could be seen as a deeply rebellious and paradigm-shifting figure who's really pushing back against a lot of the Roman values. You just cannot discount the radicalness of a statement like, in Christ, there is no male or female, no slave or free, no Jew or Gentile. That's a Platonic argument, by the way. So we'll see, right? So this is one side of the what's the other side of eternal? Yep. Temporal or limited, or right? Other side of spiritual. Earthly or physical, maybe? What's the other side of irrational? I already gave it away. That was an easy one. Now, could we carry on with this? Right? Other side of white. Right? Yeah. Right. So that this is the way that we still think the world is constructed. Why do you think the language of non-binariness is so infuriating to people? Because this is the way the world works. That's Plato, friends. That is from 300 years before Jesus. And we are still deeply invested in it because we think the world operates this way. And this was Plato's thing. By the way, Plato's thing was also this good, this bad. Okay? All the way across the board. Yeah. Now, yeah. He did not like his mommy, no. Now, Plato probably didn't have white and black, but Plato had free and slave. Right? Now, this is also this is racialized to us in our context in a way that it wasn't in the ancient world. Okay? So for Paul to then say, in Christ, there is no, he didn't say that, but it's an extrapolation that people might have had. Right? There is no eternal or temporal, there is no rational or irrational.
So everything's binary. There's no dialectical both and.
Platonic thought is, Platonic thought is pretty binary. I mean, that's the way we would describe it. I'm not sure that's the way that Plato would describe it. And so this is seized upon in the development of Christian theology, before it's even Christian theology. Okay, so I've gotten, way off of where. Yeah. So the epiphany of this, the real epiphany of this, and I'm skipping all of my notes to go down to this, is one of the epiphanies I've had is the realization that questioning that, or even being aware that it's there to question in the first place, is okay. And that's a big epiphany. And it's a really big epiphany, I know, for a lot of y'all, and certainly for people who've been raised in a particular environment in which questioning at all is not really, okay. I didn't come up in a fundamentalist background, but I might have been indoctrinated, right, into thinking that was the way it was. But you could get that from lots of different places. That's the point, is that that's not necessarily just you have to be in church to get that. No. You're going to get that from culture. It's really driven into us. So I have this idea in my head. I might not have the idea in my head that it is sinful in the way that the church would describe sinfulness, but the culture describes it as sinful too, just with a different language. That's part of Dr. Bessler's point, is that this language is out there, like, just because his point is that Christian theology responds to that as much as that being informed by, right.
Couldn't we say the dominant thing that you and I grew up with was Billy Graham? Billy Graham was the way Christianity was expressed.
Yeah, but Billy Graham is just one of many. So like he's, yeah, sure, yeah.
That would be, when you fill up the football stadium with people, that's success.
Yeah.
In America.
Well, there's people doing that on a weekly basis now. People filling up, in Houston, Texas, you got a guy filling up a former basketball arena.
Right. That's why I said that my epiphany would be there's being faithful and then there's being successful. You don't have to be successful to be faithful.
Sure.
That looks like success when you have this kind of response to America.
Yeah. So this is why this language of wokeness and this pushback against wokeness and this whole sort of why we can't seem to move outside of identity politics in our engagement has this basis to it, which is there's a movement afoot. I would argue that it's the same movement that occurs about every 500 years or so, that we have this sort of pushback against what we think are foundational arguments. And this is a really foundational one, because it's pushing back against, especially in this country, against these basic notions of how we are defined and what the framework is for that. So getting or staying woke becomes this cultural battle. But there's a reason for that. And it's whether it's trying to control what history gets taught, or how lifting up sort of an American mythology with a construction of Ten Commandment monuments or classroom plaques that suggest that that's somehow the basis for our legal system, which is not true. There's this effort to stay the course. So maybe we'll call it a cultural orthodoxy. Right? And in that framework, change is bad, unless it's change to change back to what it was. That change is good. Right? Anything that sort of stay the course. So how do we get rid of all this stuff and stay the course? Because of how existentially threatening the removal of that idea of freedom, purity, strength is. It's an incredibly threatening thing to some folks. And frankly, I would argue that it's actually incredibly threatening to all of us because we all swim in this water, whether we want to swim in it or not. One of the most effective things of helping people along, I had a great lunch discussion last week with one of the professors there, Lisa Dellinger, who's was a classmate of mine as well. And Lisa is getting ready to teach this class on post-colonial theology, which that's we'll talk about that later. But and in that she talks about, she herself is a Native woman, tribal member, all of those kinds of things. Her husband is like working in the very high ranks of one of the tribes and deeply invested in that kind of story about herself and her identity. And she's like, I have to tell people all the time, like, we're all touched by this. So to think that you are somehow, that's the opposite side of that you are somehow pure and outside of this thing, and you can therefore critique. So we're all like caught up in this. These are the values of this sort of Anglo-Saxon, what Douglas would call Anglo-Saxon stand your ground kind of mentality that infects us all, whether we want it to or not. And so to think yourself above that actually keeps you from addressing. It becomes its own, like you're almost engaging in the system then, because you're trying to get to that peace through victory over that broken whatever. You see how that works? So we get reinvested in the systems that we're trying to break. So in the environment of cultural warfare, it's, for me, is an epiphany. It is eye-opening to get permission to question things. I got that permission a long time ago from a campus ministry and a campus minister at the University of Oregon, Reverend Tom Hager, who helped me over beer and French fries, which is the proper way to discuss theology. And he set me free from sort of the adherence to dogma that I had absorbed just by living in Oklahoma. I didn't even know I had it. And he began to open up doors for me. He and Tierra Matheson, who was the first feminist Bible study class I ever took, from her, that just helped open those doors. So that may not be the same process for all of you. I certainly want to do my part to pass on such permission to you to have that kind of questioning thing, but you may need more than my permission. Often it's a complicated thing. All of that work, no matter how complicated, begins with our theology. And it begins with, I think, understanding a framework. Here's where I will lean on Dr. Bessler in helping us understand the relationality of theology. So, this is his famous theological map. Okay, so if we think about the basic components of, in our case, a Christian theology, the things that we talk about when we do some theological imagining, obviously, that's a pretty big one, right? What else? You should be able to get 3 of these pretty easy. Well, neighbor can be on there, yeah. What are like the big 3? I'm giving you a real hint. The big 3.
Jesus.
Okay, Jesus, right? And Spirit, right? And we might make a distinction here and put separate from that. We can talk about that in a minute. Okay? Not that this is his last name. Right? What else might we have up here? Church. Yeah. What else? Salvation. Yeah. That's a good one. Humanity. Yeah. Neighbor, humanity. Let's put these kind of close to each other, right? And that reveals my theology already, right? Sin. Ooh, that's a good one. Yeah.
Bible or truth?
Bible, yeah. Ooh, Bible or truth. That reveals something of a little question mark next to that, right? Forgiveness, that's a good one, yeah. Or grace, right? We'll call that grace, maybe. Love. Oh, let's put those as two separate things. Let's do love and do faith. Okay, so that's probably enough. I mean, we could go on for a long, long time. But the idea of the theological map is that all of these things are connected to each other. So, if you come in here, as I know some of you have, and been given some new information that helps you shift the way you think about God, well, guess what? That's going to shift the way that you think about all of the rest of these things. Now, that's the real easy, that's the one that we usually go to. Well, when we change our idea about God, we change. But you know what? In my experience, that's not usually the way it works. Usually the way it works is with something down here that changes, and we have to rethink our idea about God. And when we rethink our idea about God, now we've got to rethink our idea about all of these other things. I want you to know, this is why I think it's important what we do on a Sunday morning, that for a person walking in that door, maybe daring to go to church for their first time in a long, long time, giving them through our welcome and through our treatment of them and through the experience of worship itself, giving them a different idea about what this is, may very well change their whole idea about everything. It at least opens up that door where they have to begin to rethink those things. And eventually, it helps them to question some of the other things in their understood framework, the one that's been handed to them. And they may eventually get to a place where they go, my idea about grace is now really, really different. And that's going to change how I look at humanity. And that's going to change maybe even what I think about what salvation means.
As you make those changes, I think the struggle is to find the new language to express some of those changes.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the tension comes in extending that permission out. All right? You may find that you have enough permission to redefine this. Okay, I can redefine this. This is a church that walks with me. Okay, we've seen this in here, friends. Somebody who comes from a much more evangelical background, who is themselves part of a marginalized group in some way, and they come here and they experience a welcome, they have permission to do that. They do not have permission to redefine this. They can't find it. They don't have it. Nobody's given it to them. In fact, quite the opposite. And so then that door just kind of shuts, right? And then I would suggest to you they're even more stuck. It's one of the problems with offering a atmosphere in which we can ask questions and do some deconstruction and reconstruction is, where is that door locked that they can't go into? And when we start doing the relational reshaping of things, maybe they can get 2 steps into it, but they can't get to that 3rd step. And then it's like, the piston jams and the whole engine fries. So, Julie, did you have? I'm probably going to give you these just for the.
I'm thinking of one young woman who told me that seeing Gina in the pulpit leading prayer was very frightening to her, because women are not in leadership in the tradition she comes from. And she didn't quite make the leap immediately, but that meant, how do I define God if a woman can lead worship? And what do I think about Bible and all of those things? So I thought that was a really good way of illustrating how the map comes into play.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I'm thinking of, what about people who are totally alienated forever from Christianity? And I have somebody very close to me who had a baby when she was in her late teens, and was in a church-sponsored home. It was Catholic, and the nuns reminded the residents every day they were sinners and they were bad. And that woman is never going to be following, but she's very spiritual, and she's found a New Age religion. And so all these things below God are very different for someone like that. But she's one of the most Christian people I know.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
So one thing is just, we all find comfort in religion, but there's a difference. There's a spirituality that comes from believing in God that really is separate from religion.
Absolutely.
And so all these things below God are entirely different for someone in another faith. And I believe that everybody, or people who believe in a power beyond ourselves and a creator, or may call it by a different name, but that makes Jesus is not the only way to salvation.
Right. Yeah.
So, but just as everybody on the far right finds a lot of comfort in, thinking they know the answers to all these questions, we need to be aware of falling in the same trap.
You bet.
I have a question.
Chosenness.
And
Chosenness is a really deceptive thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Well, so a while ago you talked about these cycles, about every 500 years the woke people sort of take over or have influence.
Right.
So is the cycle like there's an impact by people who are thinking differently, things change a little bit, and then we slip back into the same old thing of finding comfort in believing this way?
Yeah. Is the answer to that. Historically speaking, you can see that cycle sort of repeat itself over and over and over again, and it's in part because, if I believe anything about a sort of notion of, in any way, shape, or form, of original sin, something that's in us, which I don't really believe theologically, but I do believe sociologically, that there is something in humans that seeks comfort first and foremost. right? So the thing that is comfortable to us can be damaging to other people, but that if it's, as long as it's comforting to us, and particularly if it's very comforting to us, that damage can be rationalized away. And so that's a powerful drug that we as people don't want to do away with very much, because when you listen to the language of Jesus, Jesus talks a lot about this idea of living by faith and living by trust. And so the notion that he offers to his students of, why do you worry? Like, what? It can't add a single second to your life of worrying. The birds in the field, they don't worry, they're fine. Just be like the birds in the field. And I can just see, because I know how I hear that. I can just see his disciples going, what in the world are you talking about? Like, that fills me with such anxiety when you say that. Like, I can't trust like that. What are you talking about, right? And yet the model that we have is someone who trusted so much. The Philippians hymn is supposed to be this ancient hymn. It's in the 2nd chapter of Philippians. And the Philippians hymn says, Jesus trusted so much. He had all the power of God. That's a later formulation. He had all the power, and he gave it away. He gave it all away. And he acted like a slave, the language says. He acted like a slave. He gave that away, and he emptied himself and became obedient, or became trusting is the language in Greek that is there, even to the point of death on a cross, which is not a trust I have. I'm not even sure, as I wear this thing, that it's a trust that I seek to emulate. That's my full confessional moment. Is that something that I see as a goal of mine? God, I hope not. But that's what's being sort of laid out there. That is another way of talking about this idea of transcendence. This is not a religious map. This is a theological map. Now, it uses a lot of particular religious language in it, but we could shift this to say, God, that is the thing bigger than us, beyond us, a transcendent thing. Jesus, that is this transcendent thing that's known to us in human beings. The Spirit, that is this transcendent thing that seems to work in our lives in some way that usually we can't explain it very much, or guides us, or gives us this thing, or, gosh, man, this thing seemed to work out when I thought it was going to hell. Here I am, right? That's the language that we use from Christianity, but that language is used in all other religions and talked about in all other religions, with the point of that not being the Christian formulation of God, but the point of that being transcendence. How do we find in our lives as human beings connection to something that is bigger than us? Because that's the empowering thing. And you can do that in lots of different ways. And unfortunately, religious systems have so damaged people that they can no longer use that religious system to get to this. Usually this, has become such a wounding thing that they can't, this system, they're going to have to use different language to get there. But I would argue the goal is still the same, reaching for that transcendence, which is the point of all of this. There's my epiphany for the day. Don't do that. Don't do that. This is all Joe Bessler, so just give a proper attribution. I don't want to be accused of plagiarism. Okay. So next week, even more epiphanies. I will not have been in graduate school the week before, so we'll probably take it down several notches, okay? It'll be a little less footnoted. How about that? Thank you all.